Good afternoon and welcome to the third A-Level History catch-up session. Today we're going to be focusing on Unit 4 and it will be delivered by Miss Thomas. I'll hand you over now. Thank you, Miss.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Karen Thomas and I'd like to welcome you to today's History A-Level presentation. Now this is my first session with you and I will be focusing on Unit 4 today. Now, as a quick reminder, just to remind you that all the recordings from the previous sessions are all online now. So if you follow this link to the e-sgol's website, I will be reminding you of it at the end of the sessions or with a bit more step-by-step guide, but every single presentation that's been covered is there for every subject. Okay, so it's quite useful for you to be able to go back and see previous presentations as well. Now, with regards to my presentation today, my presentation is going to take around 35 minutes, and if there are any questions, then you can submit them using the chat function during the presentation, and I'll go over as many as I can then live in the last 5 minutes or so, whatever we've got left at the end of the session. Now, let's have a look at what we're going to be doing today then. So to begin, I'm going to be giving you an overview of the whole A-Level course. And then today's session, as I said earlier, is going to focus primarily on Unit 4. Now, there are 8 topic areas of the depth study, and we're going to be looking at each of those, and hopefully you'll be able to identify which depth study unit you actually study. We'll be comparing the question 1 and then the question 2 and 3, looking at the stems of the questions and the type of questions asked, and looking at the layout and the styles as well. And then we're going to focus mainly on question 1, which is the compulsory source question today. So we'll be looking at how to analyse the sources, how to write them up, some top tips, looking at the WGC expectations and turning them into student and teacher friendly expectations, and looking at a couple of checklists that you might want to use, look at some possible sentence starters, and then also look at the WGC banding at the top level, which is the level 6. So hopefully I'm going to refresh some current source skills that you have from this year and from Unit 2, which you did in Year 12, and perhaps give you some new ideas as well on how to approach the work that you're now going to be doing in your school or college. A little overview of what we've looked at so far. So you've looked at Unit 3 with Mr. Morell, and you looked at the different sections and obviously the traditional exam, which is now on 45 for that Unit 3. I'm going to be going over Unit 4, which is the depth study. And as I said, we're going to do the compulsory question today, and then we're going to look at the essays from one essay from a choice of 2, which will be done on next week's session. Now, traditionally, you would have an exam for 1 hour and 45 at the end of Year 13 for Unit 4. You do have Unit 5 as well, of course, that's your non-examined assessment, okay? And basically, these 3 units make up 60% of the course during your Year 13. Now, if I can just talk to you about the Unit 4, even though we won't be going down the traditional routes of external exams this year, there is obviously a high possibility that you'll be required to answer assessment, past paper questions for these assessments now that you're back in school or college. So I'm hoping that these sessions are going to be extremely valuable to you to help you to prepare for the assessments that you will be doing in your schools or colleges. Because obviously you want to get the best mark possible as evidence that you are capable and that you can produce work at that certain standard or grade. So question 1 is your compulsory source-based question, and then question 2 or question 3, you would choose which one you prefer to do. You would do 1 essay from the choice of 2. So, as I said just now, there are 8 depth study topic areas, and you should know now which depth study you actually cover. Now, I would have loved to have done a lesson on content for you for this session, but it would have been an impossible task to do because, as you can imagine, your sixth form school or college will have chosen a perhaps different topic to another school or college, so it wouldn't have been fair to be able to do that today. So what I'm going to do, I'll run through first of all the 8 depth study topic areas. I'll just go through them very, very quickly. And remember that now that you're in Year 13, you do the part 2 of the course, which is in bold. The part 1, which is in the brackets, is what you would study in Year 12. And in the part 2, you would do in Year 13, and that would be your Unit 4. So you may be doing challenges facing Mary and Elizabeth. That would be coming out of the mid-Tudor crisis, which is depth study 1. Or you may be doing Civil War, Commonwealth and Protectorate, which is depth study 2. Possibly doing protest campaigns for social reform, or maybe you're doing economic and social challenges in Wales. You could be doing Depth Study 5, which is the spread of Protestantism and Counter-Reformation, or maybe you were doing France in Revolution, which is 1792 to 1815 in Year 13. You could be doing the crisis of the American Republic, that would be Civil War and Reconstruction, 1861 to 1877, or maybe you were doing Depth Study 8, which is Germany, Democracy to Dictatorship, and in Year 13, the part 2 would be Nazi Germany, 1933 to 45. Now, with regards to the content that you need to know, this is obviously a depth study, so you need to look at the correct specification for the depth study that you do. So make sure you know and understand each key issue and the content in that specification. Now, you've probably all been given them to you by your teachers or your sixth form colleges, but if you don't have one, then you can find your specification by following the WJC link that I have here, going on to the specifications, finding Unit 4 and going through and finding the correct one for your depth study. And when you do find it, it will look something like this. Okay, this is an example from Depth Study 1 taken directly out of the WJC site. So you can see you have your 4 areas here that you will need to know something about. Okay, these are your key issues and your content subject areas. Similarly, this is from Depth Study 3. So again, you've got your 4 areas of focus where they could be asking you questions for either the essays or for your question 1, the sources. So Unit 4, the depth study, is a question which is compulsory. That is your source question, and then you choose to do either question 2 or question 3, whichever one of the essays you prefer, and then obviously that normally would be the exam for 1 hour and 45 at the end of Year 13. Now, if we have a quick look at the source questions, you should be very familiar with these because obviously they have been used with Year 12 when you did the source questions there as well. So the stems of the questions will always stay the same. So the question is, with reference to the sources and your understanding of the historical context, assess the value of these 3 sources to an historian studying. Okay, now it depends on what the question is with regards to what they're going to focus on here, and it depends what your depth study is. But that stem of the question will never change and it will always be worth 30 marks. So I've got an example here from Depth Study 1. So we can see we have the 3 sources. Okay, they're obviously a little bit more in depth, a little bit longer now, more detailed in Year 13. But apart from that, more or less the paper layout is exactly the same as Year 12. We have your question underneath. The only extra thing is that they have actually put the 2 essays underneath that source C and underneath the question. Okay, but we're going to focus just on the sources today. Okay, so there we have the example from Depth Study 6, and the paper looks exactly the same, but obviously the content will be linked into that particular depth study. So the stems of the question, when we zoom into Depth Study 1 and Depth Study 6, stays exactly the same. Okay, it changes because Depth Study 1 will ask you to focus on Elizabeth in the period 1558 to 70, and the Depth Study 6 will focus on their area of study. Okay, and obviously every depth study then would change depending on what they wanted you to focus on, but the stem of the question is the same. Now, question 2 and 3, I'm just going to go over this briefly because we're going to do more work on it next week. Okay, is choose one essay from a choice of 2 for 30 marks. So as you can see, you've got just the one side here now is source C, and you've got your 2 questions, and I've zoomed in for you to be able to see them. So this is from Depth Study 1, and you can see this is a how far do you agree question, and you could either choose that or you choose question 3, which is a to what extent question. Now we'll be looking at the stems next lesson, okay, but I just want to give you an idea of how it would look on the paper. So this is Depth Study 6 zoomed in again. So we have question 2, which is a discuss question, and question 3, which is another to what extent. Okay, so we'll be doing more work, as I say, next week on the essays, but you're fully aware now that for question 1 we do the source skills, and for question 2 we do essay skills. But today is going to be the source skills. Let's look at the background information then of what we know so far. So all three sources that will be given to you for your question 1 will be primary or contemporary, made at the time you are studying. And we, as a guide, think that you should use about 10 to 15 minutes to evaluate the sources, and then 45 minutes to actually write up the notes that you've made and to write up your response. Now let's have a look at some of the WJC advice for what you need to do. So I've issued a warning here because there's some official terminology coming up. Now the WJC say that you will need to consider the strengths and limitations of the provided sources within the context of the specific key issue rather than the depth study as a whole. Now, what exactly does this mean and how exactly would you do this? Well, in a nutshell, what it means is, what is question 1 focusing on? And you have to make sure that in your answer you focus on exactly the information that they want for the answer. So your first top tip from me is to highlight and underline the question's key issue. Now you will have done this when you did your year 12 as well. I'm sure your teachers would have advised you to do this. So we know the stem of the question. Okay, what we need to do now is to look at the key issue. Now, this is from the Depth Study 8 paper. Okay, it is a popular study choice with schools and colleges. It may not be your particular choice, but it is the example that I'm going to use for most of the session here. But remember, the skills that go with it will go with any depth study that you actually study. So don't worry if you think, oh, this isn't relevant. We're looking at the skills that go with it, and of course they are relevant no matter what depth study you do. I've just chosen this one because this is the one that we study in my particular school. So let's have a look at the question, and we are looking at what the specific key issue is, and I advise you highlight or underline the actual key issue that you have to focus on. So here the key focus is the change in treatment of Jews in Germany between 1933 and 43. So we have our time frame, and we also have the actual key issue that they want you to focus on. So we know we're looking at the changing treatment of Jews. We're going to work towards filling in a little checklist, okay, that you can obviously take away with you then. So the first thing you need to do is identify the key issue, which is what we've done in that question. So let's look at the next step. So we've got official terminology alert number 2. And this is from the WJC, and they say you need to debate and offer judgment on the value of the sources to an historian studying a specific issue with a focus on discussing the content, provenance and tone of the source, as well as the context in which it was produced. Okay, so there's lots of key terms there, but what does it mean and how exactly would you do this? Let's have a look at what exactly they're asking you to do. They want you to debate and offer a judgment. They want you to decide how valuable the sources are and give your judgment on that. And they want you to decide on the specific issue that they give you, how valuable the sources are. And they want you to focus on the content of the sources, the provenance, which means where they've come from, and the tone, how the sources have been written, as well as the context in which it was produced. So they want to know what was going on at the time. So, okay, we've broken it down. We know what the exam board and your teachers will want for you in these assessments, but how exactly would you do this and what does this mean? Well, again, in a nutshell, you need to highlight and underline the relevant information to each source, which can be found in the attribution. Now, the attribution is the bit underneath the source. Okay, this will help you to put the source into context before you read it. And I suggest you do this to actually read the source. So let's have a look at this 2019 Depth Study 8 paper. So this is source A. I've zoomed in so that you're going to be able to see, hopefully, in the devices that you're using. And first of all, we look down here, okay, at the bit that's in brackets. Where does this source come from? So it's from a Nazi daily newspaper. It's an article within it, and it's in March 1933. So we will highlight or underline the important information there straight away. Now you will see that I have written alongside the source the actual key issue. Now the reason I've done that, and I suggest to my students that they do this, is that they can keep a focus on what the key issue is, so that when they're writing up or making their notes, which we will do around these sources during the session, they can keep their focus to what the question is. Okay, so it's the change in treatment of Jews that we are focusing in on, and now we've looked at the attribution. It's up to you whether you then go on and read the source and pick out the important bits in the source that you might be commenting about in your write-up, or if you go on and do all of the attributions. Personally, I like to know where all of the sources come from, so I will do it my way, but obviously you can decide which suits you. With source B, again, you'll see I've got the change in treatment of Jews, so we're focusing our answer directly on that. And underneath here, if you look to see who has written this source, we've got the American consul in Leipzig, who have written a report to the American government following the events of Kristallnacht in November 1938. So again, we have the timing, we know what this report has been written after because of Kristallnacht, we know who's written it and to who. So there's a lot of information in these attributions that we really need to be able to write about later when we do the write-up. And then we've got our last source, so we look at source C. Again, down the bottom here is the only place I need you to look for the time being. So it is Himmler, okay, head of the SS, and we've got him speaking to SS leaders, and we have the date to that in October 1943. And again, we've written the key issue there, so we know what we are focusing in on. So if we go back, okay, and just have a look at this. This is from Depth Study 2, and you can see this is what your paper should look like at this point, okay? You've got the highlighting within the attributions of who has written this, why they're important, the years that it's focusing in on, and then the actual question with the key issue, okay? The only difference here is the key issue hasn't been written next to each source, but this is from Depth Study 2. Okay, so if you go back to this, we have now looked at the provenance of the source. We can tick that off. Provenance just simply means where does it come from, and all of that information is given to you in that attribution, the bit in brackets underneath the source. Now the next thing we have to do is look at the content. What are the main points that the sources are making? Now, what we have to do is obviously read through the source, okay, and highlight and underline the important bits within the source, and maybe do some little notes alongside if there's anything of importance that we need to remember to write up about later. Now, I'm not going to spend too much on this, okay, time. If I just give you sort of 20 to 30 seconds, you might not read it all, but that's fine. I just want you to get a little bit of an overview of what the source is saying, okay? So don't worry if you don't read it all. What you can do later, you'll have a copy of this presentation, or you can download it later. You can obviously pause it and read it in your own time then, but just 20 seconds just to get the overview of what's going on. Okay, don't worry if you haven't done it all, okay? You just would be looking for certain bits that you think that is important, that you want to underline and highlight for future reference in case you need to go over anything, okay? So you're looking at the Jews being treated obviously at the start of the Nazis, okay, when they came into power. So we've got this being put into the daily newspaper for people to read, and it's what they're going to be, this boycott that they're going to be putting together, who is going to involve, when it's going to start, how they're going to implement it with SA and SS, posting guards, and all of that information is there in this article, okay? You would do the same then with this particular source. So again, I'll give you just 20 seconds just to have an overview. Don't worry if you don't have time to read it all. Okay, so you would have highlighted or underlined certain elements in this source, okay, looking at the words they're using, looking to see what's been going on now that we're a couple of years in to the Nazis being in power, looking at the way that the Nazis are treating the Jews at this point. This is obviously from an American point of view, that there's no police intervention, that there's this horrible treatment of men, women and children, the physical violence. It's, you know, a cry for humanity that this is going on. They need to do something to stop it. So that should be highlighted, ready to write up in further detail later. And we'll look at the last one, which is the source C. Now, this is from Himmler, and this is again further on in 1943 in a speech to the SS. So again, if I just give you 20 seconds, just have a little overview of what the source is saying here. Okay, so highlighting things like the words that they're using, the ferocity of the words, the way that they're trying to explain what's happened in this horrible way, and, you know, obviously getting an overview from what Himmler is saying in this speech to the SS. Now then, once you have done your highlighting, you have obviously then looked at the content, and you may have written some extra words or bits of information alongside as well. Now, with regards to the content, there are some extra things you should be looking for. Now, the date, obviously, that comes under the provenance. We would have commented on that. And the authorship, again, is there. The audience, who's going to receive this, again, is written in the attribution. The form simply means what form does this take? So is it a speech like the last one? Is it a newspaper report? Okay, you just have to explain where this source is coming from. The language used, I'll talk about that in a second. And then there's this extra bit here, additional information on the topic. Now, with regards to additional information, obviously there is a need for appropriate reference to the context, but only as long as they are linked to the actual sources. Now, that's really important, because if you just put in anything you know on the topic and it's not linked to the actual source, you're not going to get any extra marks for that. Okay, it says here there are no marks for a display of knowledge, but obviously you need to put in knowledge if it is relevant to that particular source and you're highlighting what's going on in context to that source at that time. So be very careful with that. Now, also important to know, this has come from the WJC, and obviously this is for Year 13 specifically. Knowledge and understanding previously learned in Unit 2 should be utilised when addressing the content of Unit 4. Unit 4 also provides an opportunity to assess both the skills and knowledge gained in Unit 2, where appropriate. This ensures progression from AS and shows a strong element of synoptic learning in the overall depth study. Now, what exactly does this mean? Well, it means in pupil-friendly terms, your skills and knowledges from Unit 2, question 1, can be used in this question if it's appropriate and relevant. Okay, so if there's something that you want to bring up as additional knowledge that does fit in and is of relevance and does fit into the source's context, then of course it can be used, and they recommend that you do that. But don't bring up something from Year 12 if it has no relevance whatsoever to the actual source and to the point that's being made in your key issue. Now then, I mentioned this in the checklist and I said I'd come back to it. It's about the tone of the source, okay? So what you have to do is to decide how this source has been written, the language that's been used in it. Now the source A, what I tell my students is to write a T and then to put in a couple of words that they can write up later about how the source is actually written. So this one, which was the Nazi newspaper, is designed to unite all the Germans against the Jewish minority. So it's trying to bring them together in the words that they use and the way that it's been written. This particular one, which was the American government, a report to the American government from the council, this tone is obviously anger there, there's despair there of how the state is now encouraging this violence, encouraging German people to condemn Jews in this horrible way, and the tone is really of desperation, despair, anger and upset. Okay, so you would comment on that in your write-up to source B. Now with source C, you've got Himmler, and this was his speech, of course. The tone is very cold, okay? It's very self-congratulatory. It's absolving the Nazis of any guilt. So we would treat this with caution because we know who's saying it, we know why he's saying it, and we would put that into our overview on the tone of this particular source. So we can take tone off the checklist as well. Now, with regards to reliability, there's two words that could be used if they're of relevance: objective and subjective. Now, objective is a source which informs. It's pretty balanced normally and quite factual rather than being biased or opinionated. So if you do have a source that fits that category, you could use the word objective. Subjective is also a word that could be used. Now, this refers to information that's based on personal opinions. Normally, it's quite emotional if a source is subjective. So you have to be careful which one you choose if there is a relevance, and if you can use them, then you obviously could include these two words in your source analysis as well, okay, for reliability. Now, remember, you are being asked in your question on how valuable the sources are, okay, to your key issue. You have to work out, do these sources tell you everything you need to know on this key issue, and do they explain it well, or do they have positives, or do they have negatives? Okay, the value is really important. So what we do here is we look at the strengths and the value that comes across from the particular sources. Even if you don't agree with them, we are talking about the actual source themselves. So the strength to this particular source is that it's evidence of anti-Semitic measures within months of the Nazis being in power. Okay, showing how economically they're excluding Jewish people from a very early time. Okay, it's sort of like the start, it's a signal of the start of the discrimination, unfortunately. And obviously you could bring in other things that were happening at this time or just later on. So you could say the same month, you know, Jews were dismissed from civil service. You've got in September, they were prevented from inherited lands. So you're bringing in your knowledge, but within the context of that source. It's almost like a public justification of how they are now going to treat the Jewish people. So, you know, it's valuable in showing that the racial policy was implemented in a very controlled fashion and very, very soon to when they have come into power from this source. So that's the strength and the value of the source, and that would be a plus, okay? Now, on the other side, you have the minus, the limitations or biases or weaknesses or any omissions that have been left out, okay? So obviously here, the limitations is because it's a Nazi newspaper, it's going to be sympathetic to the Nazis' racial policy, and it is obviously publicly justifying the methods that they are now starting to use against the Jewish population. So we would be careful with this source because of those limitations. So a plus and a minus, okay? Really, really simple bullet point, so you know where you're going with the write-up of this source analysis later. You would do the same then with source B. Okay, what are the strengths here? Well, in this source, the American consul, okay, is showing now that the treatment of Jews are becoming more extreme. So it's actually a major turning point. And if you put it into the context of what's going on at this time, you would know that Kristallnacht was what happened because of the von Rath murder. So it's showing now that, you know, to German people that trying to encourage them almost to take part in this collective condemnation of Jews. And it's a change from sort of earlier haphazard practices. Now Nazis are a lot more economically and politically secure. It's 1938, and they are being more extreme in their treatment of the Jewish people. The limitations or biases or weaknesses, obviously we'll treat it with caution as it's an American report, okay, and we would pick up that from the attribution, but we have to weigh out that, you know, the strengths as well as the limitations. We must do both with every source analysis. With the last one, which is Himmler, okay, looking at in his speech to the SS leaders, I've done this slightly differently. We look at the context, because this is, of course, putting into what was going on at the time. OK, so later again is 1943 in this source. So it's repeating Hitler's prophecy, basically, from 1939 regarding the extermination of the Jews. So this is almost trying to justify the actions that have or what will be taken next. And it's showing that there's a struggle for racial survival for the Nazis. You know, the Wannsee Conference, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, these are things that have already taken place. You can mention those in the context of what's going on. Himmler believing that he has the moral right to exterminate the Jews as well. But when we look at the actual source itself and see what the value are, you know, it's full of implications of the anti-Semitism that was apparent during the war. It's revealing the very radical thinking and the Jewish Bolshevik trait and the threat to all Germans. And the limitations, biases and weaknesses obviously is coming from a Nazi viewpoint. They're trying to share the blame without accepting any of the guilt, and obviously that is a limitation, huge limitation in this particular source as well. So we've looked at a judgment as well, from adding up the pluses and minuses as well, and coming to a reason on how valuable that source is. Now, this is a slightly different version of the checklist, okay, that we've used. At the bottom, just here, you can see I've written down linking of sources. Now, if there are any similarities or themes that run through the sources, you can also link the sources up. Okay, so that's a good thing to be able to do. Now, by now on your exam paper, there should be lots of highlighting and underlining and notes made on everything that we've just discussed. And that first 10 minutes is a very busy 10 minutes looking at the sources and pulling them apart. Now, remember that you need to be underlining the key issue in the question, the attribution, the source's content, and actually writing little notes on each source, on the tone, the strength, the limitations, all around the side of the source, and the context, what was going on at the time as well. Now, all of these notes can be used then to write up a really focused and detailed answer. Now, it is important to note here as well that examiners and teachers do not want to see a very formulaic, pre-learnt, set in stone almost structure in the writing up of your sources. And what I mean by that is they don't want to see every source analysed in the same order, in the same way, all the way through. Okay, they want to see it written in a flowing way, and it doesn't matter in the order that you address everything in your checklist, as long as it is all covered. So it might be an idea with your notes as you're writing them up to actually cross them through and to make sure that you know that you've mentioned that, and therefore you can go on and write up the other bits of information that you've got to make sure you don't leave anything out. Now, what I have here is the WJC mark scheme to go with that 2019 paper, and that covers the next 3 slides. Now, it's really important here that we look and note that the WJC include the word the students may include. Okay, so you're not expected to mention everything that's on the next few slides. And also don't think that, oh, I would have said this, but obviously it's not in the mark scheme, so I wouldn't have got a mark. That's not true. Okay, you could still be wanting to mention something that is relevant and will be awarded marks, so you needn't worry about that. So you can see you're not expected to mention everything. Okay, and what you've got to do, as we said all the way through, you're meant to analyse and evaluate with a high degree now of discrimination, because obviously in year 13 you should be very aware of how to do the source analysis. You need to look at the strengths and limitations of this. You need to judge their value, their content, the authorship, the bias, purpose and validity. You deploy knowledge, but remember the bit at the bottom, your answers may include. Now, what I have here is the source A from the WJC write-up on what should go into that source analysis. Now, I'm not going to read through this or expect you to do so. As you can see, it's quite lengthy, but obviously you can perhaps download the presentation and pause it and read it in your own time, or when you receive a copy of it. But go through this and see, would you have mentioned some of these things in your write-up? Okay, so this is source A, sorry. And this is the write-up for source B. And I've also included the WJC write-up for source C. Okay, so you could actually go through it and see if you would have mentioned those things in your write-up. So you've made your notes around the source, and now you actually need to get on with writing up your notes in your 45 minutes that you've got left. Okay, so what I have here are some top tips for your introduction, your main and your conclusion. Now, remember I mentioned earlier that examiners and teachers don't want to see a formulaic set in stone structure. Well, it's the same thing with the write-up here. Okay, so I've been very careful in what I have put in as sentence starters, so that you can obviously choose and mix and match, adapt improve or change or make better. Some of the things that I have written here, just so that you can make sure that you're putting your own flair to it. And obviously it depends on your key issue that you're given as to how you write your actual answers. Maybe for your introduction, sentences like the sources, whilst they all have their uses and are valuable to the issue of, and you'd obviously put your key issue in there. They do vary due to omissions or biases which affect their overall value. Or maybe you could say something like the sources are only small extracts, so they're not comprehensive to the topic of whatever the key issue is singularly. However, they each hold their own individual values, or maybe they have different opinions on. Now, with regards to the main body, it's absolutely essential that for each source, at least once you write, the source is of value to an historian studying whatever it is, okay, opposition or the translation of the scriptures or the change in treatment of the Jews, okay, as in what we've looked at today. Source A is of value because it suggests it was written by, then this further adds to its value because. Source B is relatively valuable to an historian studying whatever because. However, it fails to mention, and you can obviously add context in there. Whilst valuable, source C does need to be treated with caution because. Now, even if you struggle to understand the sources, because obviously they're a little bit longer, a little bit more in depth in year 13, a decent comment which gives you a reason why the source is of value to an historian studying whatever could potentially get you 20 out of 30. And all of the sources they give you will have a value. You just need to find it. And remember to give a mini judgment on each source as you're finishing the source analysis. Now, I've got some more from the WJC actually here, okay, contextual possible sentence starters, value sentence starters, and limitation sentence starters. Okay, so again, I won't read through these now. You can go back over it in your time and see if any of these would be suitable for you to remember to use in your own write-up at a later date. Now, I've written here to remember to use your highlight and your underlining in your notes, okay? Remember also to use that treat with caution because that means that you are saying that this source does have limitations or biases, but it will still have a use in some other area as well. And remember to always tie it back in to why it is valuable, because every source they give you will have a value. Now, last bit with regards to writing up, which is the conclusion. Now, in your conclusion, you need to bring everything together and comment on the collective value. So sentence starters such as, collectively, the sources are of value to an historian studying, or in conclusion, the sources are very valuable to an historian studying, or the sources do provide use and are of value. Okay, and maybe a little bit of a longer one here, they have different opinions of, but when they're used together, they're of greater value. Each have their respective omissions or biases. They're small extracts. They're not comprehensive to the topic singularly. However, together they do provide insight into, and when used together, they provide a balanced overview. You don't need everything here, obviously. You choose what you think would suit you in your conclusion. And remember to reiterate that the sources, whilst they all have their uses, they do vary in value, okay, because it depends on what's been left out, their omissions and their biases, and that does affect their overall value. But obviously the three of them used together, which you can do in the conclusion, are more valuable to you for giving you an overview of how things have changed, okay. Some little top tips then, okay, it's absolutely essential, remember, at least once you write the source is of value, okay, even if you struggle to understand the source, give a reason why it's of value, okay, and potentially that will bump up your marks. Make sure you do a conclusion on the collective value, okay, of the three of them together. All of the sources will have a value, okay, they wouldn't provide you with useless sources, so you need to figure out what that value actually is. So you would have, if you've done all of those steps and all of the things on the checklist, you would have discussed utility, you would have discussed limits, you would have put into context, and you would have given a judgment. Now, just remember, just some general do's and don'ts for question 1. Don't assess the source from a formula and trawl through them, okay? You need to have them flowing. You need to comment on more than just the content and the attributions. Don't copy long sections of the sources out. There's no need for a long historical introduction or any irrelevant background material. You don't need to rank the sources. Don't forget, you need to address the actual question. Now, what I've put in here is a mark scheme, which is band 6, which is the top band for this Unit 4 question. And just look what you need to do. You need a sustained and accurate analysis and evaluation, which focuses on the context of the sources. You have to give a full and substantiated judgment. You have to look at the value, and you have to look, at the issue over the period set. Now, if you do all of that, which is what we've just done, then you could be accessing that band 6 marks. Now then, next steps for students. First of all, what I suggest you do is to ensure that you know your specification for your particular depth study. Download it if you haven't already got it. Practice the techniques either given today or which you have already mastered from year 12, and obviously look on the WJC site for some past papers and try past paper questions, and then look at the mark schemes to see have you answered everything in the format and the way and covered everything that's in the mark scheme. Time yourself as well, okay, writing up the notes, doing the highlighting and underlining, using some of the sentence starters, and give yourself just 10 to 15 minutes to evaluate and make your notes, and then 45 minutes to actually write up. Now, next week's session is at the same time, 4:30 to 5:10. I'll be looking at Unit 4, which is question 2 or 3. You would choose one of them to do an essay on, but I will be going over a refresh of this question 1 skills again then as well. Don't forget as well to access the recordings and the resources of the previous sessions. Okay, you will go on to the website, as you can see there. You've got a list of the recordings, and then it gives you the subjects, and you can go into whichever subject you want. And this is an example of the history ones. We have Mr. Morell's first session and second session, and obviously in time today's third session, this one will be up there as well. So thank you very much for attending today's presentation. I hope you found the content useful. If you've got any questions, then I'll now be available to answer them on the chat function. We are very close to the end of the session, so I'll just have a quick look and see if there are any there. Okay, there doesn't seem to be any, so I hope you can join us again next week, where I'll be looking at an overview of the question 1 that we've just done and focusing on the essays, the question 2. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Thomas, for a very informative session. We look forward to seeing you all next week.